Roles and responsibility in Agile. Now, let's look at it from the perspective of Scrum. Now, Scrum is simple, but by no means easy, and everybody is struggling with that. And I think that's for good reason. And this is also a reason why in the Scrum guide, there's less emphasis on roles, more on accountabilities, because every aspect of the Scrum team has a clear accountability, what they have thought about, what they need to do. And this is often, I think, the emphasis from people is they really look about checkboxes. What do they need to do in certain situations? And that's method thinking, which doesn't really help us in the complex. And therefore, that's when training, education, formal education in that field really helps a lot. So the way I often think about it is like in a surgery. You have your surgeon, you have your anesthetists and nurses and so on, and they're all, they know what they're supposed to do. They all know what's their accountability, but they pitch in if there's something else. So they help each other out if there's something happening unexpected. We talk about the unknown unknowns. And the way I think about it is like in democracy, we have checks and balances. We have an executive, legislative, and judiciary system. And they all watch out for the other ones, that they do what they're supposed to be doing. But on the other hand, the other ones make sure they don't overstep their boundaries as well. And this is how really everything works. And in Scrum, not in Scrum, but in regular thinking, a classical project manager is there to deliver the benefits, the scope, on time and on budget. Now, you're a good project manager if you deliver on time, on scope, on budget. Whether you deliver the right thing, that's another question. And the way I think about it, how Scrum solves that, is that instead of having a project manager who is there to deliver on time, on scope, on budget, we have checks and balances in place. Essentially, we have the product owner who's there to make sure what is the most valuable product we can deliver, giving the constraints of time or budget. And basically, this then would determine the order of the product backlog. On the other hand, the Scrum Master is there to make sure that the developers, and I equate developers here with the budget, essentially, simply, because the developers is what costs most. Infrastructure, electricity, all of these things are minimal these days. So the investment we have in our developers is what they can basically then produce given a time frame. Now the Scrum Master is there to protect the developers, that they can really get their heads down and work focused on what is good engineering practices, things like that. This is why the team can self-manage within the context of a sprint, which provides stability in that regard. And by doing this, the Scrum Master enables that the developers can really work focused with not being disturbed all the time, and produce high quality increments every sprint, which are in compliance with the definition of that. And essentially, this allows to build a product which is really maintainable and extendable going forward. And that's what you want if you work as a product owner, because you want to have a product which you can change and navigate with quickly, not be buried in technical debt, and every minor change is a huge investment going forward. Now, if you take that and you compare it with classical project management, a project has a beginning, it has an end. It has a scope which is defined in the beginning, which you don't really know about that much. And then it will change over time because we learn. It's about 35% according to studies. And then the other thing is that organizations, classical organizations, they're often organized in a matrix. So we then have the line, which needs something, and then the function areas, and then basically you pull people. So as a developer, you have two bosses. You have your line manager and you have a functional manager. And then maybe you have on top of that even the project manager you now work for. So it's always you have to please all of them. And essentially the thing which, or the manager to please, you will please the manager most, which gives you the most chance about maybe getting the promotion, the raise you're looking for. So it's more like your own agenda you bring, and not the focus on creating a specific product for a specific need according to the vision of that. Now, and how do you do that slightly different? How do you handle that? And that's really where you essentially think more in bubbles. That's the way I look at it. Instead of having those hierarchies and structures, you think more in bubbles, and each bubble would really contain a product, a solution for a specific group of people. and they have the product owner making sure all of the interaction connection happens, and then the developers in the context driven by the vision, product goal, sprint goal, which is much more hands-on. They will then develop and then always learn from the feedback from the users. I think in Agile, what's really powerful is this pause and reflect. Stop at the end of the sprint, take a deep breath, look at the product with your stakeholders, with your users, collect feedback, have a retrospective, find out what we could have done different, and then basically go into the next sprint trying to improve the product, but also trying to improve the way how we work. It's also interesting that if you look back at a little bit at the history of Scrum, I've been going through some older papers from Ken, and he clearly states that a product owner usually is a product manager. So it's somebody who really knows what product management is about, how to do that. And often he refers also to the Scrum Master as a more senior manager, a person who has weight in the organization, who has the power to shift things around. And if you now would put this person in the role of the Scrum Master, or accountability of the Scrum Master, they can really move things. And what I often see these days is that junior people, they don't really have that much experience about it. They attended a training, things like that, and they get suddenly shoved into that position, and then they end up administrating Jira and other things and helping the team to facilitate. And that's important, but it's not the emphasis we really need for the proper checks and balances we want. And the way I think about, if you really set up Scrum correctly, with your roles, Scrum Master, product owner, and your developers, it's like, if you think about nuclear fusion, there's this tokamak thing where basically the magnetic field, if it's set up right, everything kind of the hot plasma stays at the right location. And that's how I think about it, because if you do this right, if you put the checks and balances correctly, you would get this perfect force field, and then good things will happen for a time. But you always need to watch out and measure. And this is when I often think about another quote from Dave Snowden. And that's quite going deep, but in complexity, we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries, and that allows locally and temporary valid solutions to emerge. So it's again about putting all those places into the right context, bringing in good practices, enabling constraints, how we call them in complexity theory, so good feedback loops essentially. And then we reach the situation where everything is in the perfect place for now. But it can change. Maybe customers start to think different, something else happens, laws change, or even minor things. And maybe you just lose one person in a team and it all collapses again. But then you have to reestablish it again and again. And I think this is really this continuous looking at keeping everything in the right place, having the forces in the right location at all the time. That's really an important aspect of having a good Scrum Master and a product owner with the developers in place as well. So it's really important that after every sprint, you pause and you reflect. You think about how you could improve the product by working with your customers, but also then you self-reflect with the developers about how you could work better, efficiently, more effective in the next sprint. And then you keep on doing that, always trying to stay in the sweet spot within your force field. Now let's have a quick look at classical project management practices. And there was this famous quote from the PMI, the Project Management Institute: plan the work the plan. So set up the plan and then follow it. And that works great if you work in a simple and in a complicated environment where it's essentially possible for us to know everything or to identify the things we don't know yet so that we can analyze and break them down and find answers to that before we execute on it. So essentially that means that the batch size is everything. So we plan everything at the very beginning. And then we plan everything, we analyze everything and so on. And then we go through our phases until we make the release at the very end. We give it finally into the hands of our customers. Now, if the batch size is the maximum possible, which is everything in this case, the learning size is the maximum possible as well. So you, by design, you want to learn as late as possible. And again, that works for simple and complicated because we pretty much can plan and do everything up front. However, now if you work in the complex where we have the unknown unknowns, those surprises popping up left and right and here and there, and it could be small things like, I don't know, like problems with some operating system versions we have, or inconsistencies in our networks, and but maybe even bigger things like we have experienced that, like Corona and wars and other things. And suddenly the nice plan you created in the beginning doesn't work anymore. And then we start to struggle because there's really, well, we have change management and other processes and mechanisms in place, but overall, the whole thinking isn't set up for doing that. And this is really where Agile really helps, because I think by working iterative and incremental, driven by a clear vision of what we want to achieve. And please remember, if you say we have no clue, let's start do something, be agile, that is misunderstood agile to the highest degree, because if you have not a clear understanding what is the outcome you want to achieve, you will not be successful anyway. So we actually slow down a little bit by planning, doing, learning, reflecting, planning, doing, learning. And if you do this essentially again and again, driven by your clear vision, you have much better chances of creating something which is the best possible outcome for your customers. It might be slightly less, it might be slightly different, but it's always in agreement, because we will bring in the customer stakeholder feedback while we work on that. And that's why in Scrum, the sprint reviews are so important. Now let's bring this quickly back to the classical project management, which is really heavily driven by activity, where you work with the highest possible batch size. And by doing that, by design, you want maximize the learning possibilities as well. And again, this works for simple, complicated. If you work in the complex, you have a tough time ahead. Communication and collaboration within teams. And that's a really important factor for me, because in the end of the day, I personally believe it's the team, the people, how they work together, which basically will be successful. And we all have seen that in I don't know, soccer championships or the Olympics. There's this outsider which suddenly is like winning the hearts of the people. Why? Because they really play together. They take the same effort and work together really, really hard, and they give everything. And that's a great team. That's what we want. And sometimes, we have the world's best soccer players put together into one team, and they're mediocre because everybody is like, I'm the best and I have to shoot the goal, and everybody wants to proliferate themselves and be successful. And no, they will do good anyways, so it'll be fine, but they won't, first they won't maybe not win as many games as they should have, and they will not win over the hearts of the audience. And I think that's the customers in this case. So good collaboration is important, but collaboration also works only if you have good communication in place. So I think it's really it's possible, and really you need to look into that we have good ways of communicating within the team. And this is when I look into the Scrum values like respect, courage, openness. Now, you should be able to say somebody you did something wrong, or really, but in a respectful way. And if you manage to do that, trust will emerge over time. It's like, it's okay to ask for help, or it's okay to give feedback. And this has a lot to do for me also with the growth mindset, where Carol Drake is talking about that. And but communication also needs to be directed into what do we want to achieve. And if we use Scrum to build a software product, well, then we need to make sure we have the communication aligned correctly for that. So, and in every environment, there's a specific language, idioms, so say, which the team also needs to be aware of. So often it's helpful that at least the product owner has product management skills in that field, has education in that, but also then when he or she collaborates with the developers, give them the understanding what certain words mean in given context. When I was working for a biotech company many years ago, there's this word assay, and there's probably 5 different essays, but the word is the same, but it really depends on the context. If you do an essay with pipetting over there in a um, when you want to multiply some genomes, and then there's an essay over there slightly different, and I can't really recall all of the details anymore, but it was always, when the word essay came up, you only understood it, what it means, if you have understood the context it's being used in. But also we work in the complex environment where we have the unknown unknowns, and so we don't often really know what's going to happen. We have some uncertainty, and that's hard to write down. When often, if we think more in a classical way, we are much more document driven, so everything is written down. And I'm not against documentation, but it should be meaningful. And now, on the other hand, if you're good in writing, you bring probably 30% of your knowledge on paper. If you're a good reader, you get 80% out again. So this is a lossy process. Now, the way I think about it is often more like, who should talk with whom? How often? To transfer this understanding, so that you have the chance to say, stop. You were just talking about essay. Do you mean this or that? Do you mean, and then, I mean, okay, now I get it. And this is really, I think, for me, the most important aspect in that regard, is that we get a chance to clarify why we talk about that. And that's often why nobody really knows about that, or they have never really thought about it. That's why we work with stories in Agile. It's not the format that essay or something. It is about the promise for the conversation. I tell you something and you can ask questions, and I take all the time until you have it understood, so you can do it correctly. And that's also a very powerful tool. And this is, if you go back to complexity theory, that's a really powerful enabling constraint. It's like a barrier which really pushes you back if you would wander off in the wrong direction. So it doesn't give you the answers, but it helps you to find the right path going down the road. To quickly summarize, if you work in a simple or in the complicated environment where you know more, or where you know what you don't know and you can plan for that, collaboration, communication isn't that important. You could just write it down and give it to people, and they can execute on it. And it's because it's simple and it is complicated. But remember, you most likely work in the complex environment, and this is really about sparring together, talking to each other, getting answers to your questions, and really emerging, allowing to the right answers to emerge, going through those conversations. And there's the concept of the groan zone. It's kind of when you are in an unpleasant area in a conversation, but embrace that groan zone, because after the groan zone, if you start to converge, good things will be visible, understood, and people can act correctly accordingly.